Hi, this is Dr. George Pereira. Welcome to IHS OUM for the course Listening and Speaking in ESL. And today's topic is about listening and language learning. So, these are some questions for you on listening and language learning. What is listening in the language one, first language? What is listening in the second language, L2? So, what is listening in L1 and L2? What are the potential problems in language 2 listening comprehension? What are the models of listening comprehension? So, listening in language 1. An examination of listening in the language 1 and compare it to listening in the language 2. So, various schools of thought regarding first language acquisition are there. These schools are the behaviorists, innatists, cognitivists, and social interactionists. So the behaviorism, that language is innate, that is another cognitive school. Uh, then cognitivists, the cognitive aspect of listening. Then the listening as a social interaction, more constructivist approach. The dimensions involved in the process of acquisition, such as the nature and nurture controversy, that the language is innate, it is by nature, but nurture is the social interaction aspect. So universal competence of a language or individual variations in listening development. So the special language capacity that seems to be innate in humans is of not much use if it is not exposed to rich linguistic environment. So that is the nature and the nurture, innate, and also it is socially learned. The same is true for the development of our listening ability. Children are equipped with a mental capacity to acquire language efficiently. So, however, this capacity is dependent on the acquisition of knowledge of the situations and people around them. So, there is the inner capacity, but this capacity is developed. The, uh, the natural, by nature, the skill is developed through social interaction, through situations and people around them. So, in terms of listening, they develop the skills only when they can match new linguistic input to what they know of the world around them. So, listening as a skill develops when there is also a new linguistic input. So, they have to match it with what they already know, the prior knowledge. So, learning to listen is a skill. So, what is it? Children are equipped with the mental capacity to acquire language efficiently. So, the language is innate, is the nature. However, this capacity is dependent on the acquisition of knowledge of the situations and people around them. So, the skills only when they can match new linguistic input to what they already know about the world. So, it is a close link to his or her cognitive development. As the child experiences new objects and situations, the child develops language to deal with them. So, as teachers in the classroom, so we have to provide a rich linguistic environment for the children to grow. Piaget was among the first social scientists to note this close link and went on to describe the stages of cognitive development in children. What is important is that these stages occur through repeated, guided social interactions, which are primarily oral. So the child has the innate ability, and these stages occur through repeated, guided social interactions, primarily oral, according to Piaget. So all of the child's early language development is oral. Oral in nature, the child develops the language orally with the oral, that is listening aspect of the oral. So, as the linguistic development of the child has been quite thoroughly covered in your earlier modules, it is sufficient that we highlight several important features here. There are stages in listening development: prominence and stress, recognizing content words and stress syllables in different age groups, newborn to age 7. Concrete things stimulate 5 senses in listening development. Then overgeneralization, that is extension of meanings of words. So let's go with the first one. Children tend to focus on the stressed and repeated parts of words and phrases they hear, suggesting that prominence and repetition play a major role in early acquisition. This means that children tend to recognize content words and stress syllables first. For example, the word mom is repeated by the mom and the dad. So the child learns that and gives prominence to those words, that the child is listening, and the child will repeat those words because the parents would repeat these names to the child. So the first parents would be very happy when the child starts talking, and that means speaking. After listening, the child will try to utter the word mom, dad. Okay. Second, children can only deal with concrete things, objects or situations that they can perceive with their 5 senses: mom, dad, the dog, so forth. In order for children to understand the language and respond, it must refer to here and now situations, here and now. Not yet abstract, it's here and now, concrete. The development in listening ability also follows this move from concrete objects, events, to later on to abstract ones like love and so forth. Third, children go through an overgeneralization phase where they extend the meaning of the words they hear to cover a whole range of objects, situations, and events. For example, kitty, referring to the cats, can be the name for all the four-legged animals, even a dog and cow, all that, cat, kitty. So, what are the 3 areas mentioned by Piaget? 3 phases of language development, especially in listening. So, these are the 3. Then, child and the adult listening. Are there differences or similarities? 3-day-old babies show a preference for speech sounds, while 8-week-old babies can already distinguish the emotional qualities of voice, love and anger. First speech sounds and then slowly it develops. Parents treat a child's wide range of non-linguistic behaviors as replies or conversational turns, giving the child the first experience as a listener. Child smile and raising the hand and all that things are taken as signs. Non-linguistic behavior. That is child's first experience as a listener. Although young children may not be fully proficient in the content of the listening material, they seem to be quite adept in the social aspects of listening. So that is another important area, social aspects of listening. It should be noted that studies conducted into the development of listening in children involve listening materials with non-demanding information content. Familiar and interactional topics now. Other studies using listening inputs that are novel and informative have highlighted the importance of listener contribution to communicative success and the problems that young listeners faced. So, listener contribution to communicative success and the problems that young listeners faced. There are problems they face. So, you're going to investigate what kind of problems they face. Specifically, there are three main types of problems. Children up to the age of 7 do not realize the importance of message quality. These children blame themselves rather than the message quality, even if it was highly ambiguous language. For if they have guessed the message correctly, they think that an ambiguous message was adequate. By the age of 8, most children have overcome these difficulties. So that's the time, from as children grow up, they begin to question and critically think. Even if what the parents say, they begin to question. It's a part of their development. Children have problems assessing message quality. This means that they have problems recognizing when input is ambiguous or uninformative. Even 11-year-olds found it difficult to make such judgments. Unlike adults, children rarely provide feedback for speakers. Children usually do not confirm that they have understood messages that are clear and simple. More seriously, they fail to comment, query, or ask for more information when listening to messages that are highly ambiguous or unclear. So, these are three situations, listening problems young children face. One is the problem assessing the message quality. The other one is not realizing the importance of message quality. The third one is rarely provide feedback to the speakers. The three things. So what are the three problems faced by the young children? Is the answer. Then problems in listening development. Children may suffer from what is termed receptive disorders. So these are categorized in table. Physical, social, cognitive, and linguistic. Receptive disorders. Physical may be due to a lack of healthy hearing and speaking apparatus, may appear as inattentiveness. So there's hearing problems. Social may be due to restricted intake input, may appear as a lack of sensitivity to the social context and rules of conversation. So that may be restricted intake. They don't listen to the social situation, or the input is also less. Then the cognitive may be due to developmental disruption, may appear as an inability to establish and maintain discourse topics. So these are cognitive problems in the children, or social problem, physical problem, discourse topics, and or to so may appear as an inability to establish and maintain discourse topics, and or to identify and establish discourse reference. Then the fourth one is linguistics. May be due to restricted intake input, may appear as a lack of linguistic forms to enable cohesive ties between utterances, the logical connection between utterances. So these receptive disorders, according to Rust, echolalia, slowness to develop an interaction, inattention to salience. These things can be put in other words: echolalia, slowness to develop an interaction, inattention to salience. Echolalia, it is meaningless repetition of another person's spoken words as a symptom of psychiatric disorder. Meaningless repetition here. So, as in the conversation below, is a disorder where the child repeats or echoes utterances in the discourse without attention to the transactional direction. Did you go camping in the woods? Go camping in the woods. Yeah, did you ever do that? Yeah, he never do that. Where are you going home? Are you going home? That kind of language. A second type of receptive disorder is slowness to develop an interaction. It's slow. As in clear in the following example, the child is interacting appropriately but is not elaborating in an expected way, that is, without so much prompting. Do you play with P? Yes, I do. Hmm. Play with him after school. Yes. A single or rare occurrence of such slowness is normal and to be expected, of course. However, repeated occurrences of patterns like the above is an indication of a developmental problem, either physical, social, cognitive, or linguistics problem. So these two that we discussed are due to those reasons, physical, cognitive, linguistics, and all that, due to all these things are these three problems. Inattention to salience is another common disorder. In this case, the child, while appearing to be cooperative, needs a lot of prompting in order to attend to the topic of conversation. Salience means the important content. Consider the example below. So the adult shows a picture of a boy whose clothes are covered with mud. This is a boy going to school. He is going to school. Can you notice anything special about him? He's going to school at 9 o'clock. It could be 9, or when it comes to school. It could be 9 o'clock. Or it could be 9:30. The adults, okay. He could be out of the bus. But do you notice anything special about him? Yes, in this picture. That is uh, his school bag. That is his blue trousers. I think there is a muck in it. Muck. Do you notice he's mucky? Yes, because he was playing around with football. So the salient thing is covered in mud, clothes. So the realization, the salience is slow. As in the earlier disorders, repeated occurrences suggest a developmental problem that needs attending to. So other problems in listening development include acuity of hearing, physical or environmental problems, discrimination and auditory perception, recalling what they have just heard and recalling the correct sequence of words or utterances they have just heard. That's the problem. And problems in attention, concentration, and comprehension. Okay, so that is regarding language 1 mostly, but those also influence in language 2. So language 2, second language development. Before we can go to look at listening in the L2, perhaps important that we consider the relationship between the two. We could essentially relate L1 L2 listening in three ways. L1 and L2 listening are separate processes. L1 and L2 listening processes overlap to a certain extent. L1 and L2 listening processes are fundamentally the same. In the textbook, you will see a figure as well. So, what do you think? A, B, or C? Think about your answer. 1, 2, 3. Research shows that there are many similarities rather than differences between L1 and L2 in listening comprehension processes. So, position 3 seems to reflect this relationship best. Listening processes are fundamentally the same. So, that's the option suggested. Listening and language 2, second language learning. The relationship between listening and L2 learning has to do with comprehension. Creation, the researcher, has claimed that comprehension plays a central role in language learning. So listening comprehension is the primary mode of input for language learning, either for L1 or L2. Studies of L1 acquisition among children have yielded two essential characteristics among others. But before that, we have to think about the word. I will ask you the question, what is comprehension? It's a technical term, and what is it that we have to understand? So that is, the comprehension is the ability to understand completely and be familiar with a situation, facts, and so forth. So, familiarity with the situation, facts, and so forth, and understand that completely. Ability to understand. So, learning to understand is another theory, another concept that we have to think of. Learning and teaching to understand. So, that is comprehension. So, how do we test comprehension? Understanding of children is there one way of checking that. So, what are these two characteristics? Children are typically allowed a silent period during which they are not expected to attempt to produce language in response to the primary auditory input they received. Even among the adults, in adult learning of a second language, there is a silent period. They go through the same thing when they learn a second language. After they have begun to produce language, children clearly understand more than what they can produce. So when they start producing language, they understand more than what they can produce. These characteristics have a major influence on at least two areas of second language learning and teaching. First, they gave rise to a variety of teaching methods known collectively as the comprehension approach, total, of which the most popular is total physical response, or TPR. What is TPR? The comprehension approach focuses on developing comprehension at the beginning phase of a language course without requiring second language learners to produce. Practitioners of this approach claim that not forcing the second language learners to speak before they are ready to leads to increase confidence, motivation, and competence. We have to give them time. There is a silent period. Second, these characteristics brought attention to the equation of comprehensible input in language learning. That is very important. Comprehensible input to the level of the child. More specifically, when input is used for comprehension and for learning. This is still hotly disputed. However, what is most important for our purpose is the fact that the comprehensible input should be first in nature. It represents a problem or gap in what students know. So, it represents a problem or gap in what students know. This will induce cover them to cover the gap, that is to learn. Problems in second language listening comprehension. Learning to listen in our first language is far from easy. Follow then that learning to listen in the second language would be even more difficult. So figure problems for second language learners or listeners, different theorists, different situations they have presented. Frost, 1994. Anderson and Lynch, 1998. According to Rust, motive is a problem, can be the problem. Transfer, psychological and social transfer is a problem. Access to comprehensible input, neurological development. Then for Anderson and Lynch, background problems, language problems, and listening problems. That's how they look at the problems in among second language listeners. So let us go to Rust. So what is Rust's theory? Discuss that. Could be exam question. According to Rust, the main problems for second language listeners is motive or the lack of one, the purpose, motive. We learn our native language primarily for self expression. So, do we need a second language for self expression? This, I think, applies to Sri Lankan context as well. That is to learn basic objects and concepts and associate these to words for communication. Second language learning, whether in adults or children, always occurs at a later stage when there is no longer the immediate need or motive to express through language because already they know a language to express. A second problem is transfer, both psychological and social. Psychological transfer is the process of using knowledge from one concept to learn another concept. In simple terms, this means that our learning of an second language is always filtered through our knowledge of the first language. So transferring problems from first language to the second is not necessary also. So second language cannot truly be learned fresh as an independent system since it must be tainted by what we already know about how a language works. So there can be issues in this. Psychological transfer is the process of using knowledge from first language concept to learn another concept in the second language. In listening, this problem is made more serious by unfamiliar contexts or lack of background knowledge that could result in negative transfer. This is termed as social transfer. The second language listener is required to make judgments about which aspects of the first language culture that can be transferred to the second language communication event. So in addition, there are different communication styles. Introduction of new topics, forms of greeting, leave taking that could pose problems for second language listeners. So that is also the cultural element because we learn a language with cultural expressions. And in the second language, the cultural expressions could be different as well as when we have international communications. A third problem facing second language listener is access to comprehensible input. Second language learners normally do not receive the same degree of input as a child directed speech received by children learning their first language. See the stages they go through, trying to listen to the sounds and then utter the content words. So only the more extrovert second language learners would seek the input needed to develop their listening skills. So lastly, there is the problem of neurological development. Second language is often learned way after the critical period, at which point certain brain developments are complete. That means they may try to learn as adults or as teenagers. So the research some argue that the second language also should be introduced when they are children. This may result in poor listening comprehension skills among adult second language listeners because the brain is already developed. But there is another argument that adults have the well developed brain, so they have the capacity to learn a second language. So, according to Anderson and Lynch, That's the second theories we were discussing, Rose. So this is according to Anderson and Lynch. Anderson and Lynch define the comprehension problems of L2 listeners as background problems, language problems, and listening problems. Actually, these problem situations are important to understand the what you call the language difficulties. Especially, this is helpful for the assignment, for to identify the learning difficulties of listening skills for second language learners. That is our assignment. So, background problems, language problems, and listening problems. Background problems relate to shared schematic contextual information. That is the 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 schema theory, that is cultural patterns that they have learned. Sometimes it is a lack of this information or not a lack of mastery over the second language that causes comprehension problems. So claiming that second language learners face comprehension problems because of the language involves two assumptions. First assumption is that what they are doing is learning a language and nothing more. Second, L1 speakers do not experience similar comprehension problems. So according to the background problems are these. These assumptions are questionable. Firstly, we know that we do more than learning a linguistic system when we learn a language. We must also be familiar with the target language culture to a certain extent in order to achieve communicative competence. This is because language is the vehicle through which culture is expressed and passed on. Secondly, second language learners underestimates the first language speakers' comprehension problems. So if you have comprehension problems in the first language, it may transfer to the second language as well. First language users also may fail to understand each other. Speaker may wrongly assume, share the same background knowledge. This is true either in terms of language or culture. So now we are going back. Background problems related to background problems. Then we are going to the language problems. Language problems relate to problems that are primarily linguistic. It is logical to assume that an second language listener will face problems with difficult language input. Here the difficult would be in terms of its syntactic structure. So this was the focus on psycholinguistic studies, the structural problems, syntactic problems. They tested a range of grammatical structures within single sentences to see how easily these sentences could be understood. So these studies had one flaw. The sentences were given without a meaningful context. So the findings do not throw light on the actual difficulties listeners face in the real world. So research now focuses on more relevant considerations such as the way second language learners overcome their language insufficiency and so forth. Research into the type of language produced for second language listeners revealed three major features: a restricted set of grammatical structures, repeated exposure to large chunks of language, well contextualized and predictable input. Three major features of language produced for L2 listeners. So these are the three areas: well contextualized and predictable input, repeated exposure to large chunks of language, restricted set of grammatical structures. So there is research from Hatch. In real life, second language learning situations, the learner can, to some extent, get the language input tailored to his or her particular needs. By indicating that she cannot understand what has been said. It is thus very important that L2 listeners participate actively in whatever communication they are in to get as much of this modified input as possible. One good way to do this is to request for clarification. The third type of problem is listening problems or problems in the process of listening. So we were talking about actually here language problems, then the other one. So this is the first one we were discussing so far, and then the second one. So you just take some points to elaborate, and then the listening problems. Now we are going to go to the listening problems. The third type of problem is listening problems. So problems in the process of listening in the second language. These are indicated by through discourse analysis studies. It's called discourse analysis. That is Anderson and Lynch, 1998. That is examining how second language listeners cope when conversing with native speakers. So we analyze the discourse to understand the problems. The studies indicate three main skills that are essential for second language listeners. The implications for developing the skills necessary for successful second language listening, which emerges from a wide range of studies in L1, L2 context, is that teaching programs should not overemphasize comprehension as the process of identifying sounds and matching them against the learner's store of known words. So not only is this not all that L1 speakers or proficient L2 learners do when they listen, but such acoustically based approaches are likely to handicap rather than help the second language learners. Hearing only. The acoustics. Compare problems outlined by both Frost and Anderson and Lynch. Try to identify which problems are most relevant to your own encountering L2 learning and give reasons to support your claim. So these are two questions for you that we have elaborated. So actually the lesson ends here for this third type of problem, listening problems. Problems is the process of listening. So these are two questions for you. Compare the problems outlined by both Frost and Anderson and Lynch. So try to identify which problems are most relevant to your own encountering language, second language learning, and give reasons to support your claim. You need these theories, especially to discuss the assignment that you have to uh, be familiar with these theorists so that you want to develop your own thing for second language learners who have learning difficulties. So let us go to another approach, theorist. Underwood, 1980. For the purpose of this course, we'll adopt Underwood's list of 7 potential problems that L2 learners face when listening to English. But some of these problems are similar to the problems discussed above. So, potential problems according to Underwood. Speed at which a speaker speaks. That's true. No utterance repetition. Listeners' limited vocabulary. Failure to recognize signals. unfamiliar to context of the communication, inability to concentrate, established learning habits. All these are can cause problems. So this is another theory. Earlier we had two, and this is another approach. So models of listening, you have to be familiar with some of these things, and at least for the exam paper, maybe from Underwood, two areas, maybe from uh, Rust, some areas, understanding some problem areas you may have to discuss. Now we are going to another area, models of listening comprehension. Listening views, we have bottom up processing view, top down interpretation view, two views of models of listening comprehension. So, what are the models of listening comprehension? And discuss one model, bottom up processing view, or discuss the top down interpretation view. So, since 1980s, there are the bottom up processing view and the top down interpretation view. The bottom-up processing wave looks at listening as a linear process of decoding from the smallest meaningful unit, phoneme to discourse level, the complete text. Accordingly, phonemic units are received, decoded, and linked together to form words. Words are linked to form phrases, phrases form utterances, and eventually complete texts, from parts to the whole. Meaning is derived only at the end of the process, from parts to the whole. So you analyze each phonemic units in words and then phrases and the whole text. In contrast, the top-down interpretation view sees the listeners actively reconstructing the original meaning of the speaker by using his or her prior knowledge of the communication context and situation. These include knowledge of the topic, speakers, their relationship, and the communication event, and so forth. Both points of view are now accepted as legitimate to describe successful listening. We made top down, bottom up models. Effective listener will utilize both bottom up and top down strategies to understand what they hear. Then there is another concept, the listener as a tape recorder. Is the ability to remember message is used as a gauge for comprehension. So listener as a tape recorder, ability to remember. So as long as the auditory input is loud enough and the tape is of sufficient length, auditory input will be recorded, stored, and replayed at any time. Problems in listening can consequently be attributed to bad acoustics, tape deterioration, substandard tape brand. Let us consider some of the implications of such a view. Communication is a perfect encoding decoding exchange. What is spoken is what is exactly understood. Due to the above, it follows that there is no allowance for doubt or repetition. There will also be no variety. There is no different ways of looking at what is heard. So, some of the most specific problems with this view are listeners can often remember inputs that they do not understand. If we use the ability to remember as a measure of comprehension, how can we explain this? They remember but they don't understand. Listeners often can understand more than what they can remember. We have already proven that listeners tend to be selective. They select, interpret, and summarize input. So, what is encoded cannot be perfectly decoded. Communication is not a perfect encoding decoding exchange. So, these are problem areas in language learning to what you call in listening skills, all regarding listening as well as in speaking. Then there is another one, information processing theory. This theory originates from the rationalist tradition and looks at communication as a potentially perfect encoding decoding process. So, Shannon and Weaver model, information source, the message goes, then transmit the signal the receiver. So, from source, send to the receiver, the message destination coming from here, then the noise that comes and disturbs. So, listening is purely a reception. The listener is a mere receiver who does not act on the auditory input. Listening can be measured quantitatively. The denotative function of language, that is surface meaning of words, is overstated. In other words, what is stated is what is meant. Based on this theory, this is a criticism of the theory. So, this theory also considers the listener as a passive receiver of input. Some of the problems with this theory are it is not possible to measure listening quantitatively, as what is heard is actually much selected. There is no one to one correspondence between what is encoded and what is decoded. There are so many other aspects in encoding and decoding the message, the cultural background, and all that comes into the scene. When measuring listening, it is not a question of how much, but of what. So we often put more emphasis on suprasegmental features, tone, stress, pitch, to extract meaning rather than on words. We often do not concentrate on words but listen for what we want to hear. The connotative function of language as well. Then the theory, the listener as an active model builder. With this view, successful listening is seen as being able to construct coherent interpretations based on mental scripts. Mental scripts are sets of knowledge of probable sequences of events in familiar situations. In other words, successful listening is seen as being able to integrate incoming auditory input with prior knowledge and experience. So, I think all these theories should be taken into consideration and take what is best. And this is very important, no? Auditory input with prior knowledge and experiences. It's all what is the background knowledge, the culture, and everything is influencing to in the decoding process. So, coherence and interpretation. The auditory input agrees with what was previously said, is coherence with the context and with the background knowledge. Then the interpretation. The listener's decoding of input may not be accurate and is based on systemic linguistic knowledge and schematic non-linguistic knowledge. Schematic is also the background schemas. Systemic linguistic knowledge is the knowledge of the structure of the language. That is also important for the interpretation. For so this theory shows interplay of various sets of knowledge in listening source, according to Anderson and Lynch. Schematic knowledge, context, systemic knowledge, Then the background knowledge, factual, social knowledge of situation, knowledge of core text, knowledge of the language system, semantic, syntactic, phonological. So all these things are considered for comprehension, and these are the information sources in comprehension. Then there is another theory, relevance theory. Again, Rost, 1994. It looks at verbal communication as fundamentally a collaborative process involving uh, ostension and inference. Ostension, the production of signals by a speaker. Inference is understanding the ostensive act the signals produced. But this is very important. The production of signals by a speaker, that is speaking, which provides two layers of information. What is said, surface meaning, locution, and elocution, what is intended with what is said between the lines. Then understanding the ostensive act is that is the signals produced, which means finding a relevant link between the two layers of information. That's the inference. From this act, what is inferred? So, with this theory, communication is seen as an ostensive inferential exchange, where the listener tries to link what is heard to what is meant. So, we know that language has two functions, that is, denotative, what denotes, connotative, what connotes what is said and what is the underlying meaning. So, listening is seen as a construction activity. This the listener actively trying to make relevant links between what is said and what is actually meant by the speaker. So these are different theories so far we have discussed. Separately, you have to write down the points and then try to see the connections. In is a whole different approaches to second language learning and especially in listening. So these things you have to read in the textbook. Then there is another model called the communication model. This last view of listening comes from communication studies, which describe the listening process as a circular series of 5 stages: receiving, understanding, remembering, evaluating, and responding. So, 5 stages in the listening process: receiving, understanding, remembering, evaluating, responding. So, receiving and responding, but it goes through all these things in the mind. So these are discussed, and you can also download the hardcover book and notes and read. Receiving the message, understanding, remembering, evaluating, responding. So these are 2 questions for you. This is a long lesson. So you can stop the video several times and read the notes and also study it. These are actually different theories presented as well as the language problems they are faced. Stage 4 steps children use when they listen to the sounds of their first language. According to Anderson and Lynch, or you can replace it with other theories as well, there are 3 problems young listeners face when they listen to sounds. State the problems and cite examples. So, thank you. This is Dr. George Pereira, and good luck with this section. And it's a long theoretical section, but I think rereading and re listening to this will help you a lot. Okay, thank you. Take care.